Welcome to the Assureology Show, a growth hacker's guide to human capital management with your host, Mike Vanoy. Each week, we bring you experts in human resources, employment law, accounting, benefits planning, and more to build productive organizations. You'll gain practical guidance for your business. You'll be alerted to the latest news and mega trends that impact small and mid-sized companies. We'll give you the hands-on information you need to stay compliant with ever-changing employment laws, the strategies you need to win the war for talent, and much more, so you can focus on what you do best, growing your business. Enjoy the show.
Don't get caught unprepared. 12 new HR updates for 2023. Okay, this is part 2 to our series here. Last week, we covered the first 6. Today, we're going to cover 6 more topics. Too big of a topic to cover all in one show. Most of you know my guest real quick, Mary Simmons. She's the Vice President of HR Consulting at Assure. She's a SHRM certified professional. Also, for the past 8 years, Mary has been an adjunct professor at the New York Institute of Technology. Prior to Assure, Mary is the director of HR consulting for a 55-year-old HR consulting firm in New York. Welcome back, Mary.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, let's jump into it. So last week we covered 6 HR laws. Anybody who missed that, please, it's on demand. Just hop on the website, YouTube, wherever you want to pick up your podcasts. It's out there. Go ahead and listen to the first half. We're going to pick up where we left off with topic number 7, which is laws prohibiting restrictions on speaking out about sexual harassment in forced arbitration. That's a mouthful. What does it mean for employers, Mary?
Oh, it sure is. I think really important for everybody to realize this is a federal law. So, one of the seminars we gave, and I'm not sure which one of the listeners reached out to me and said, Mary, is it mandatory that I have a handbook, right? So we always say, and I probably said it on that webinar, no, it's not mandatory that you have a handbook. But when you look at all these laws, we're on number 7, right? You realize, and that's not including, the laws from the past. Right. Now you realize why a handbook's so important, right? Because if you're under obligation as an employer to inform your employees about these federal, state, and local laws, it makes it easier if it's in one document, right? So this is the Federal Speak Out Act, and it voids non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, or contractual provision that restricts an employee from disclosing or discussing sexual harassment or assault. What does that mean in English? What that means in English is that employers cannot say to an employee who has, believes that they were sexually harassed or assaulted at work, or in fact have after an investigation proves that they have, the employer cannot tell that employee, you can't talk about this, okay? So, the reason for the employer saying don't talk about it, right, is because, they don't want, possible other people stepping forward. But from a federal standpoint, they do. If people haven't been treated properly, they want employees to feel like they can come forward. And there used to be a clause that employers could say when an employee had a claim of sexual harassment or assault, they could force arbitration, and they are ending that as well. So you can't force arbitration, meaning it can go to court, right? So if the employee wants arbitration, they can have it. If they don't, it goes into a court of law, right? They can't force them to arbitration.
So look, paint a picture of an example, what this might look like. So an employee comes to me, their boss, with a concern. How might this have played out prior to the law change, and how must it play out now?
Right. So there was handbooks out there or a, form that employees filled out that said, if I have a claim of sexual harassment, I must go to arbitration. So let's just say that Jane comes forward. She says to her manager, Mike, I feel like Joe is sexually harassing me, right? So we're going to do an investigation on the HR side to see what happened. In the past, the employer could say, Jane, don't tell anybody about what's happening, and they could also force Jane to go to arbitration versus going to court. That is no longer allowed. You can have arbitration, but you can't mandate that the employee goes to arbitration. So it's a little bit of a big deal. I wouldn't think it's that big of a deal for a smaller employer who's going, what's arbitration? We'll leave that to the attorneys just to explain in details. What the important takeaway for everybody here to understand, on a bigger scale, we've talked about before the National Labor Relations Act, right? Which really governs unions, but in effect, it governs all employers. And one of the, edicts in that statute says employees have the right to talk about conditions of work. Well, the federal law, the federal government saying this is a condition of work. You can't prohibit these employees from talking about if they got sexually harassed, right? So, normally you're going to say to the person who comes forward, look, Jane, I'm going to try my best to, make sure that this isn't, that this doesn't, get around, and I'll try to keep it confidential to the extent I can, but I'm going to do an investigation. That's okay. But to say to Jane, don't tell anybody, now that Speak Out Act will not allow that. So it's significant, right?
Yeah, that's a really big deal because, I'll always come to I'll defend the intent of entrepreneurs. For the most part, people aren't out there trying to do evil and tamp down bad acts, right? But you can see how an employer might say, hey, let's just keep this quiet. We don't want to ruffle feathers. Let's let this play itself out. I got your back, employee. And be sincere about that, right? And I have your back. We're going to do a full investigation. Justice will be served here. Let's just not talk about that until the end comes out. I could totally see an employer relatively innocently thinking that that's a reasonable thing to do, but you can't. It's illegal now. I'm not understating that, correct?
Yes, no, you're correct. I think, there's a couple little nuances here, and I'll give you a good example. Had an employer, I walked in day one, I said, this woman has a claim of sexual harassment against, and let's just use these names, right? So Jane says she has a sexual harassment against Joe. I go in to do the investigation, and I have to tell you that at the end of the investigation, she did have grounds, it did appear to be sexual harassment. But in addition, somebody else in the department, the same department as this young woman, was talking about, I heard Jane made a case about sexual harassment against Joe. I think she's sleeping with, and went on and on. Now that's different. That's not allowed, because now that third individual, right, wasn't Jane and it wasn't Joe. That third employee, let's call him Mike, Mike is now actually, causing, a, situation where, she has almost another claim because now he's talking about her in a sexual nature. So, this is definitely a future.
In that scenario, Mike is stirring up crap, and stirring up crap
That's right.
about secondhand information is not the same as firsthand information. I believe I was sexually assaulted, right? Very, very
Correct.
different. The topic of
There's a
discussion
big
may be the same, but
difference.
those are very different things.
Yeah. And as I was going to say, we're definitely doing a future, webinar on sexual harassment. But, one other thing that I want to say, because it's kind of in this vein, I was also doing a handbook for another employer the other day, and they're like, Mary, I want a no gossip policy. And I'm like, really? Right. So I've seen them in handbooks and not a fan, because that is going to chill concerted activity, right? Which is talking about conditions of work by saying no gossiping, right? Our lunchroom's disgusting, or I hate my boss. Those are conditions of work, and you may consider that, gossiping. So don't think, employers or anybody listening, that by us saying that Mike stirring the pot would make sense then to have a no gossiping policy. The real answer here is you must educate your employees and your managers on anti-sexual harassment, and while we're talking about it, anti-discrimination, whether you are one of those 6 mandated states or not, because it's against the law federally. And then I'll get off my soapbox.
I think the way you put it that hit me right, that it's a condition of work. So if I'm talking about somebody's personal life outside of work, clearly that's gossip. But if I'm talking about I was sexually assaulted, I believe I'm the victim of discrimination, that's condition of work, same as like workplace safety. They don't give me goggles, they don't give me helmets. There's machines without protective gear, right? It is a condition of your work, and so you couldn't restrict your employees to, hey, don't talk about the fact that we don't have proper maintenance on our machines and we don't have covers over those flying gears and belts. That's right. OSHA would have a fit, right? I mean, so you can't discourage that. You can't discourage any condition of employment conversation. That's a good way to look at it.
Right. Absolutely. And just one other thing that I'll add about forced arbitration. There are some states, California, Washington, New York, of course, Illinois, Hawaii, Maine, that also have stopped allowing employers to mandate forced arbitration for wage and hour disputes. So I guess the other message that I want to say is, if you have a forced arbitration mandate for employees for certain lawsuits, I would consult with a professional before moving forward, even if you're not in the states that I named, because it seems to be a trend going forward. So your state might be next.
Yeah, right. Okay. Let's go. I do have questions on arbitration. I think I'll save it for, maybe it's a Brian Schenker topic, or maybe it's another day. All right. Number 8, some states expanding definitions of family members, in-laws, related by blood, or persons of standing in the place of family relationship. This is a lot of nuance here in the language, but I think the laws are becoming much more specific. Can you unpack that for us?
Yes. And of course, in layman's terms, all they're doing is expanding the amount or the definition of who's considered a family member, right? Because a lot of these leave laws that we talked about last time that are getting expanded, right? More states have leave laws, and those states that have leave laws are adding more leave laws, all good stuff. They're also expanding, right, who is a family member, right? I have a friend who, just lost her mom. She lost her father. She lost her brother. But she has an aunt that if that aunt got sick, right, she may be included in some of these definitions now where she wouldn't have been included before. So, usual suspects. California expanded the CFRA paid leave to include designated person. Oh, that's a big one, right? Because it sounds like almost anybody that you designate that, for paid leave, and New York is including siblings in their paid leave, right? So if I needed to take care of my brother or my sister, it would be covered under New York paid leave. And then, some of the other states are jumping into it and adding domestic partners. New York always had domestic partners, so did California. Some of the other states are including domestic partners, siblings, and in-laws, which I think is a big deal, right? Because I took care of my mother-in-law, and I think a lot of the employees do. So this is definitely a handbook update.
I don't want to trap you, so if you don't know it or don't want to, that's fine. California, when you have to have a designated person, any more specifics you can share for our California audience there? Like, does it have to be named ahead of time? It could be after the fact. No, that was a dedicated person. How does that work?
Those are all really good questions, and I wish California had thought of those questions beforehand.
Okay.
But all they did, they had very little guidance to go along with that. And sometimes, Mike, that's on purpose, right? Because if you start giving all kinds of definitions to what that designated person can be, now it's really not as open-ended as I believe they want it to be.
Right.
So
there
isn't a lot of guidance on that.
So the message then for employers is update your handbook and then explain it, that including that's an unknown. Therefore, you better take a liberal, and I don't mean political liberal, but you better take a liberal policy on this because it's not black and white defined. And if your employee has a designated person, then they're unless there's more clarity that the law brings, then that's who you should treat as their designated person. Am I thinking about that right?
You are. And, I also think some of these additions need some education. So a lot of times when we do an employee handbook update for the clients, we'll send an addendum. Here's the new policy, give it to all your employees, have them sign off that they read it, right? And we make a note in the handbook that this has been updated. Sometimes you also should be adding this to a manager's meeting. It might sound like a very small change, but you don't want, an employee to go to a manager in California and say, I need to take paid leave to take care of my cousin. And the manager go, no, cousins aren't covered. Well, that, it's a designated person. So I believe what we try to do is minimally educate the managers who are talking to the employees. And maybe if there's enough changes and updates to the handbook, unpack the handbook, the policies for the employees so that they can ask questions.
Okay, next one, topic 9, has to do with FLSA salary. I think we're still waiting on final federal guidance, but I think the signal has been lit here that there is change coming that employers need to understand. And this is really basic, exempt, non-exempt, FLSA kind of stuff that will impact everybody because it's federal, right?
Yes. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of my clients miss. And understandably, it's a little bit confusing. We all know that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's a minimum wage. Everybody pretty much, or most employers understand that, right? No. There's a federal minimum wage, and then your state may have a minimum wage that's higher. They can't have a lower one. And your employees get the best of whichever that minimum wage is. In this instance, it's always going to be the state minimum wage, right? For example, New York is 15, federal is $7.25. In the same law, in the same statute, salaried, that's for hourly employees, salaried employees also have a minimum salary that you must give that employee so that they can have the exemption of exempt status. Okay. And we've talked about this before, and we could we don't have the time to dive into this, but for this to go up to, in many states, Any exempt employee, the expected raise to this will be $50,000, right? And this hasn't been raised, Mike, I want to say at least in 10 years, right? You could have a manager at McDonald's making $40,000 a year that is an exempt employee, and now you need to raise them to 50 when and if this passes, and I believe it will, because it's long in the coming, right? And many states like New York and California and state of Washington already raised this minimum salary. But a lot of employers don't even realize there's a minimum salary you have to give somebody to say that they're exempt, and it causes compression. So knowing this is coming down the line, you need to prep for this, just like when there's an increase in minimum wage.
Mary, so we talked a lot about this on the webinar before. Let's spend 2 more minutes on it, because this is huge. So a lot of times I think employers rather innocently think, okay, they got a threshold. So let's say, just easy math, $10, $7.85 or whatever federal, maybe locally they're $10 minimum wage. So that's $400 a week, right? For a 40-hour week. And sometimes there's overtime, and that's fine, but generally it's 40 hours. Maybe I got a manager who maybe the hours are a little bit lumpy, right? So they need to work a few extra hours sometimes, a little under 40 sometimes. So there's this mentality that's not legal, but an innocent mentality of, I'm just going to make them salary to even out their pay, right? And so you have exempt employees who are paid salary, and it's really not that much more than, say, their hourly employees. And then you've got salary people up on the tiers here, and now all of a sudden your floor of salary is going to all of a sudden shoot up to $50,000. You could have your most entry-level salary, your lowest compensated exempt workers making more. I mean, you couldn't make less, but you're going to compress all that, and their compensation may be the same as some of your more senior people. It's going to be a nightmare, right?
Right, right. Well, I don't like to exaggerate. Let's not scare people, Mike. But this webinar is all about prep, right? You have to look at your exempt salaries, right? And see where they are, right? Is everybody above 50,000? You're fine. Do you have a lot below 50,000? Now you have to think about, if this passes, you have to make them 50,000 or make them non-exempt, right? Yep. And again, you need to discuss this with a professional, right? Because the way that you explain it to the employee is important. And don't forget, if they're non-exempt, they get time and a half. So they get overtime over 40 hours. So that might change your decision not to give them the raise to 50,000. You got to do the math.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And
do what's right.
I'm not trying to scare people. I think because the average employer, this won't be a big deal. The way they're, if I employ, fairly highly compensated people, and there's really not many people below 50, 60,000 on salary, this is kind of a non-issue. But there's a lot of, I'll say, business to consumer oriented companies, retail as an example, food service. You're going to have a lot of salaries in this range, and just don't wait. Start examining your salaries, how you compensate people, and your compensation strategy now, so that it's not just some all-at-once reaction. The law passes, now you got to implement these changes overnight. You have some time to really think about this. You may or may not have some tough choices to make, but at least you're playing from your toes, not your heels. Right,
right. Good analogy.
Okay. Anything else on what we think is an inevitability to salary raise to FLSA before we move on, Mary?
No. They've been talking about this for years, so I really think this is the year, but no promises.
Yeah, right. Okay, topic 10. More COVID laws. States of emergency are expiring. Now, this is state by state, county by county, city by city, right? There's a bunch of people saying COVID laws. I thought this is long gone.
I know.
There's lots of places that are absolutely under COVID laws right now still, right? So, California
Yes,
OSHA
yes.
just approved a replacement ETS. Help everybody to understand how to think about COVID laws, restrictions, and these what most of these states refer to as state of emergency regulations.
Right. So, listen, I feel the same way. That a lot of people do. I kind of thought this was over. Like, isn't it going to be over yet? But so the reason that I included this, Mike, is because it's not in every state. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was still thinking about this. We just had the holidays. You have a surge after holidays very often. So most states, the orders for COVID have expired. But California, supplemental paid leave for COVID, did expire, but then it still is in effect for Oakland, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, right? And then the state of emergency will end at the end of February. Right. So we're not that far off, but they're still lingering. So what I don't want employers to do is to not look at this, not ask a professional about this. If they have an employee come forward and say that they have COVID, is there a leave that they should be taking? Right. And some of the states are very silent on it. So some don't have expiration dates. So you really, really, really need to dig into it. Colorado, Georgia, Illinois, Delaware, Kansas, Rhode Island, Texas, rather than reading all this, they expire in like a week, but there's a lot of other states out there, right? So what I really, really, really want everybody to do before you tell somebody who has COVID right now, just take PTO. Please research it. Please reach out to my team and ask us so that we can research it for you, because as in everything, the states are different and the municipalities are different.
Right.
And there's definitely a lot of lawsuits, always have been, on this topic. So I want you to be careful.
Yeah. And just I'm thinking of an example. Your employee gets COVID, you're thinking, okay, I'm not I believe in being safe and protection here. And they check out the CDC website and they follow to the letter here. You might be thinking you're doing the right thing because you're quarantining, and I think today on the CDC site, it says 5 days still. I know it's practiced, it's all over the board, we should say, right? State by state, local by local. But depending where you live, there may be laws, not CDC guidance, laws that require, whether it's paid leave, unpaid leave, leave types. There are still laws on the books in some places that dictate how you must behave here. So don't just think, oh, it's over, I don't have to deal with this, everyone's over it. Or go the other way and say, hey, I'm just going to follow CDC guidance. I'm going to follow the science. Those are all good things, but follow the darn law. That's what you have to do as an employer here.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. Let's spend some time on this next one. I think there's a real trend, and I'll say a couple. I think it's going to be our next two topics. Number 11, Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, but then there's also a follow-on around all kinds of potential laws that we got to watch around lactation in nursing mothers. But let's stick with pregnant worker. What is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act?
So, this one kind of is a little perplexing to me because they slid it in at the end of the year to the appropriations bill. It did get passed. It's a federal law. But it mirrors the EEOC pregnancy discrimination policies and many state policies. I really didn't see anything all that different from what we already have under the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, pregnancy discrimination. And remember that when we talk about discrimination in any respect. And here we're talking about pregnancy. This is from when you place an ad all through employment. So what we forget about a lot of times is the woman who comes for an interview and they're pregnant. And on the face, you cannot say, no, I can't hire you just because you're pregnant, right? And that would take another hour to go into detail there. But on the face, I'm sure everybody understands what I'm saying. So this is, giving additional protections for pregnant women and also for lactation accommodations. So that is definitely something that it's been around. It's very similar to the EEOC, the current policy, but I think what everybody should get out of this is they're sitting up and looking, which means that their ears are very open to listening to litigation on pregnancy and lactation claims. So employers need to educate themselves very quickly. You need to update your handbook, and you really have to train your managers. Super important for your managers. If you're utilizing our services, we're going to do the heavy lifting. But if the manager's talking to a woman who's pregnant, they need to understand what can they say, what can't they say, when should they say, go talk to Mary, et cetera. The training is just very important.
So basically the law, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, that's new. But incrementally, you believe it provides essentially the same protections we already employees had and pregnant women had under EEOC, right? So
correct.
Audience should not misunderstand. Hey, this isn't a big deal because this isn't anything new. This is still a huge deal because you always had to follow the EEOC. So maybe just a 30-second primer on EEOC. This is just carving out the same protections under a very specific name.
Right. You know what? Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
So we had an employer, happened to be a bank, and I'm sure everybody can picture when you go to the bank. I don't think anybody does anymore because you just go to the ATM, but you go to a bank, right? And the tellers are behind the windows usually, right? So one of the tellers was pregnant, and she said, gee, could I have a stool? I just want to sit. And they're like, no, we don't sit. We don't think that shows good customer service if you're just sitting behind the teller line. No. Now, when I tell this, I know people listening are like, that's appalling. That's horrible. But the employer just didn't understand the law, right? We always need to make a reasonable accommodation for disabilities, but not everybody realizes, the pregnancy is a disability, and, something small like that. Or another instance that we had was, the woman who was pregnant said, gee, I know I get my half-hour lunch, but can I just go in the back and grab like a little snack, like have another 10-minute break because, I get a little dizzy. And that was denied. Right. The big one, of course, is the woman comes and they're like, yeah, I'm pregnant. I'm due in a month. And they're like, well, I'm not hiring you. You're pregnant. Come back after you have the baby. So, education, understanding the law, not discriminating based on the protected classes, and pregnancy is a protected class.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's always been protected. But I think you're right. The fact that they created the new law that essentially just says the same thing, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, that should be a red flag to everyone that this is going to be something that the federal agencies are going to be on the lookout for. And by the way, is this Department of Justice? Is this a DOJ? Who's the enforcement parties here?
You know what, Mike? I don't have the answer to that. Well, it's the EEOC.
It's there you go. It's the EEOC and privately in court. So, right. Yeah. So EEOC still enforces, but the fact that a new law exists with that very specific name should be a signal to everybody that, hey, this is an area that they're going to be looking out specifically for. So,
right.
So that is a law that did pass. What are you seeing as potential changes in 2023 around lactation in nursing mothers?
So there's been a lot of laws passed, right? So break time for nursing mothers law was passed in 2010, and that was a federal law. And then Pump for Nursing Mothers Act was also signed into law in 2022. Basically, the short of those laws is that you have to give a nursing mother time off to nurse in addition to their lunch break, right? So you can't make them do it on their lunch break. And some basic guidance on how long that break is. It should be a paid break, where that break can be. And then the states have dug in, and some of the states will carve out their own nursing mother law, like New York, which is very specific, like there should be a separate room that's private, right? So, blinds on the windows, able to lock the door, not the restroom, a stool, and a refrigerator. So it becomes very, very specific. Now, I deal with employers all the time. We had a restaurant and they were like, Mary, there's no office. I'm like, the manager doesn't have an office? And they're like, well, yeah, but I said, then that's the room they use. They're not using the ladies' room, which happens to be the restroom that all the customers use too. How's that going to work?
Yeah, right.
So
right.
I believe, and the states have in the works that there will be even more lactation laws being passed in 2023 that are, as strict as New York. And, what I'm just prepping employers for is that, this is something serious that you need to think about. And, Mike, a lot of times I'll do a handbook, let's say for a construction company, and they're like, Mary, I have 1, 2, 3 females here. They're in the office and they're, over 50. I don't think they're having children. You still have to have a policy in your handbook, I'm going to tell you, right? So if it's a policy that has to be given to employees, put it in your handbook. It doesn't cost you any more for me to put it in your handbook. Just put it in your handbook, because tomorrow, you could hire somebody that this applies to. Are you going to remember to update the handbook? I doubt it. Right. So,
and remember the purpose of the handbook. The handbook is not your orientation. Right. It's not the PowerPoint you take people through to give them the warm fuzzies of employment. It is an expectation setting document. So I don't want to say it's all legalistic, but it is very, very much there to protect both the employee and you, the employer, to make sure you've communicated the laws as they exist and it is updated as the laws get updated, right? So just because it's not the warm fuzzies and you think, oh, this doesn't apply to me right now, don't be foolish and leave it out. Include it, because you never know what person's going to quit tomorrow and the person is going to hire to replace them the next day, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And then just one last thing before we talk about, how you can prepare yourself for all these laws coming down. There's a lot of scrutiny on non-competes. So there's a lot of states that already, don't look favorably on non-competes, right? So a non-compete, a lot of times it's for a salesperson. An employer will have them sign a non-compete that says for 60 days or 6 months or a year, you can't go after, clients in this radius, the clients that you used to work with. And what the DOJ is saying is, listen, the DOL, the Department of Labor, is saying is you got to give people the opportunity to make a living, right? So whether you terminated them or they resigned, they have to be able to make a living, and non-competes stop that individual, right, from making a living. They're a salesperson. If they can't sell in a certain region, how are they going to make a living without short of moving or commuting 4 or 5 hours a day? So
and the more
there hasn't been
whether it's a
changes
salesperson or anything, you develop a skill, you develop a Rolodex of customers, maybe based on industry or geography. You develop a certain skill and a vocabulary and an experience set around products and services. It's like the further along you go in your career, the more restrictive any non-compete would be. Like if first year out of school, first job, I can switch from this industry to that geography and there's no pain. But if you've been in the same industry working for the same 2 or 3 companies for the last 15, 20 years, I mean, you're messing with my family at this point if you say I can't go to work for anybody else in the industry, right?
That's right. So look, what I would say here is, you don't have to stop doing non-competes. You're going to do a little bit better if you make them a little less restrictive. Certain states, California and New York, Colorado, Washington, you're really under a lot of scrutiny, right, when it comes to the non-compete. But what I try to do with employers is say, okay, why do we want this non-compete? Obviously, we don't want to lose clients, but what are the other things, right? So non-solicits are okay when you talk about, don't take our other, salespeople or other, staff, from our organization. Non-disparagement, I always encourage, right? So you don't want them going to your competitor and saying, whoa, XYZ company that I used to work with was terrible, right? So those, aren't under quite as much scrutiny, right? Yeah. But, think about why you want these agreements, and can you get the same result in a different way, right? And, there's a lot that you want to think about, right? Salespeople, do they, they resign, you probably want them out and their computer shut down right away. So they're not pulling, confidential information, right? So there's a lot that I want, everybody listening to think about and be prepared. It's under scrutiny, they haven't said there's no such thing and they won't hold up in courts. But I can tell you right now, as it exists, they don't hold up very often in a court.
Yeah. Yeah. And the trend just continues to lean more and more over time to the employee, not the employer here. So, all right, Mary, let's go.
Absolutely.
12 topics over two weeks here. Topic number 13, what should employers do about it?
So to prep, look, we're looking at your handbook every single year. And if you're not working with Assure Consulting, you need to do that. Please have a professional help you. Happy to move in there. But the handbook has to be updated. There is some federal changes that need to be done. So that handbook, regardless, should be looked at every year. It might be something internal that you want to change. You also should conduct an HR assessment. So, look, we can't audit ourselves.
Can I stop you for a second, Mary? I want to stop on handbook. Google is not sufficient. And Google may get you, maybe just through your own business experience and your knowledge in Google, you can get the federal laws. But we talk about this almost every single week. What used to be a handful of big federal laws is exponentially growing into federal, state, and local versions of the same law, right? So one federal minimum wage, 50 different state minimum wages, and there are a few hundred now local minimum wage laws. This is becoming exponentially more complex. Google doesn't know how to search. There's no source of truth for Google to rely upon, and therefore you can't rely upon Google, as fantastic as it is. You need to have a source of truth, an authoritative source, to update your handbooks every single year. That's off my soapbox. Go ahead. Right.
And interpret it and make it, culturally sound, et cetera. So as I was saying, the HR assessment, you can't audit yourself, right? Doesn't really work because you wouldn't have done it wrong the first time, right? Yeah. So we like to do HR assessments for our clients and look at their documents, everything from their ads all the way through termination letters and everything in between, helping with, what do we need to change based on some of these legal updates? What has changed in the organization that needs to be reflected in those documents, et cetera, making sure that, number one, they help streamline your HR function, that they are compliant, right? And that they are a document that is helpful, right? It's not just busy work. We're not asking employees or managers to fill out, 2 forms that give us the same information like my doctor's office. I'm like, didn't I just give you my name and address 20 times? You really don't want that, right? It's inefficient, to say the least.
Yes.
So I love those audits. And then, in addition, I would take a deeper dive. Listen, if you do nothing else, a pay equity or a pay audit should be done.
Yes.
And you're going to really look for 2 main things. Who do you have classified as exempt? Are they meeting the salary minimum right now? And if that federal law change comes in and it goes up to 50,000, how close are they to that, right? And even if they're making 52, Mike, but they've been with you for 10 years, the next manager you hire has to come in at 50. So you may want to think about using some of that ERTC money and giving some raises to some of those managers that are close to that 50 mark in anticipation of that happening.
Because it's illegal to prevent employees from talking to each other about how much they make. They're going to find out.
That's right. That's a condition of employment.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I want employers to look at, of course, is pay equity, right? If Mike and I were in the same exact position with the same exact, similar experience, never be exact, but similar experience in education, we should be paid the same. It should be equitable. And if it's not, changes have to be made. And by the way, you're not decreasing pay of Mike, you're increasing Mary's pay. Okay. Very important that everybody, realizes that. I would also do an I-9 audit. I can tell you that Homeland Security hired an additional 10 to 20,000 more auditors. So I believe that they will be out in force. I said that last year, and I really thought I was going to be right, but who thought the pandemic would drag its heels and not get the heck out of here? So it didn't quite come to fruition. So I believe this year they need the money. They're coming. They're doing some audits. So do an I-9 audit. Be prepared. I would
this
also.
Is one that we did a previous webinar that it was surprising to me how simple this could be, because it's you're not talking about the Department of Labor. I don't think is coming in. This is Homeland Security for I-9s, and you don't have. It's not like Pandora's box gets open to all your HR records. You'd literally have a binder, a folder, some electronic or paper that here's all my I-9s, so that when an officer comes in to look, thumb through, look through it. Oh, yes, you're compliant. It really can be that easy. But if you don't audit it and have that documentation at the ready, that's how you get in trouble, right?
Agreed. And there's a lot of turmoil this year for sure. Inflation's through the roof. Do some stay interviews with your employees. And I would recommend you start with your best performers, but do it across the board. What do you like about working here? What suggestions do you have for us to make it a better place to work? Do some employee surveys asking those questions, because sometimes employees feel a little more comfortable doing it, confidentially and giving you that information, right? Look at your remote hybrid / in-office schedule. I will tell you, it is the hottest button for your millennials and your Jay-Zs, who are the biggest generations in the workforce. Look, it's important for everybody. If somebody was home for 2 years doing a great job, to bring them back into the office full time may be the trigger they need to go look for another job. So think about what's the best schedule for your business, right? So that's, your number one goal is to grow your business, and we're here to help with that. But also think about what's going to attract the right candidates and retain the people that I have. How can I make this work to everybody's advantage? Hybrid's probably the answer there, but what, enumeration of hybrid you do depends on a lot of factors that are, specific to your organization.
I might script the number, but Gallup polls, I want to say the sample size is over 1 million workers every year. That's around employee engagement, how engaged they are with their employer, and do they work in an office? Do they work from home? Do they have a hybrid between? And the data is crystal clear. It has been every year for a long time in this annual survey from Gallup, that people who are full-time in an office, full-time virtual, are equally disengaged. The most engaged employees have flexibility that just aligns to the modern life. So there's have good policies, have them in a handbook component. There's also the fact that if you want highly productive employees, you don't have much choice. Now, there's some jobs that require you to, if you're running a lathe, a CNC machine, you got to be in the workshop, right? If you're working retail and serving, if you're a barista, you got to be in the cafe. But for any job that you can be flexible, you're crazy not to at least give it a hard look, right? For productivity and just the talent pool that opens up to you. So,
right. Don't bring them back just to bring them back. That's the bottom line. Don't say you have to come into the office just because. That's not an answer. That's not a positive look.
Here's what I'll say, maybe in closing. So, really do my very best in this show to just bring the very best information, whether it's interviewing Mary or Brian Schenker from Jackson Lewis, our the law firm we partner with for HR compliance, or any of the authors and podcasters and thought leaders that we bring in. It's always just to bring the best information, and we don't turn these into a big infomercial. I'll make a plug for Mary here. Her and her team are pretty amazing. They work with small businesses just like our audience here. They know the laws inside and out, but they're practical. They're not going to just put together some super legalistic HR process that doesn't have to live in the real world, where you manage real life employees and have to hire in the real world. They can be a serious partner. And because we do this in a fractional virtual kind of a way, in leverage technology, we can do this for pennies on the dollars compared to what you could ever hire a SHRM certified HR professional in-house. So plug to you and your team, Mary. You really do. You help people out every day, and it's appreciated.
We love what we do. We really do.
Yeah. Amen.
Thank you.
With that, Mary, thanks so much. Always love talking to you, and thanks to everyone else for joining today. Until next week, we'll talk to you later. Thanks.
At Assure, we build human capital management software and services that help 90,000 companies like yours attract, develop, and retain great people. Our low upfront cost and affordable subscription model allow you to save cash to invest in things that drive growth, not overhead. To learn more about how Assure can help you claim up to $26,000 per employee with the Employee Retention Tax Credit, automate your payroll, and build productive teams that are compliant with ever-changing HR laws, visit AssureSoftware.com.